Today we're going to observe Western civilization turning against its own builders. We're going to look at some of the forgotten episodes of martyrdom in the modern period. So join me for stories of tragedy and heroism today on the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. Welcome to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Today we're talking about martyrdom, and we're talking about some of the forgotten episodes of martyrdom that have occurred within the Catholic world in the modern period. Some of them will be familiar to you, but others perhaps not. And yet each of them, it seems to me, should be known by everybody. Each of them would make an extraordinarily moving motion picture. And yet, nothing so far. That's a note to all you Catholic movie makers out there. There's no short supply of movies of great heroism. Now, I've chosen particular episodes that I think aren't especially well known or deserve to be better known. There are a great many others, and at the end of this episode I'm going to give you some reading suggestions. Because if you're like me, you just can't tell what you should be reading. You don't have 12 books by your bed or anything. You could always use a couple more. Well, I'm going to give you a couple at the end. But for right now, I want to go back to the 16th century and tell you briefly a story you may already know, but remind you of a figure you may have forgotten. And I want to talk about King Henry VIII. King Henry VIII of England would have been the last person people would have expected to persecute Catholics. After all, he wrote a book in defense of the Seven Sacraments in 1521 against Martin Luther. He had no sympathy for Martin Luther whatsoever. Now, I'm not going to go through the story of his annulment and his various marriages, because then we'd be here for a whole other series. But for now, we'll simply say that King Henry VIII wanted to annul his marriage, marry another woman, and the Pope did not approve it. But he did it anyway. And in fact, he took the church in England and broke it away from the church around the world, and declared that from now on, in the mid-1530s, that he, the King of England, would be the head of the Catholic Church in England. So the universality of the church around the world was threatened by, in effect, this self-imposed act of schism. So what happened after that? Well, of course, there were people who objected to this. What right do you have to do this? Is the annulment of your marriage valid? Is your power to claim that you are the head of the Catholic Church, is that something that has any roots in church history? Can we abide this? Now, many of you know about the story of St. Thomas More, the former Lord Chancellor who opposed what the king was doing and could not, in conscience, support him, and was executed. Now, St. Thomas More, in the year 2000, was declared by Pope John Paul II to be the patron saint of politicians, which I thought was a particularly mischievous move, meaning that politicians should, in effect, be so committed to their consciences and to the truth as to be willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for them. But there is a forgotten figure in this story, and that's Bishop John Fisher of Rochester. John Fisher was a diminutive figure. He was a very old man, and frail and sickly, and he was the one bishop who had the courage at that time to stand up and say that he could not accept what the king was doing. Now, there have been great times of heroism among Catholic bishops in the history of mankind. For example, during the French Revolution, Catholic bishops were exemplary in many cases. But here we had just the one example of John Fisher, and he was loved by everyone. And on that day when he came out of the Tower of London, holding his small Bible as they led him to be executed, the people gathered and watched, and he addressed them and said to the Catholic people that I have come here to die for Christ's Catholic Church. And he was executed. But my favorite part of this is a popular story that followed thereafter, because his head, Bishop John Fisher's head, was placed on a pike and placed along with the heads of some monks who had also resisted the king on London Bridge. Now, during his life, John Fisher had been very pale in complexion and indeed sickly looking. But in death, with his head on that pike, his face took on a reddish hue, such that he looked healthier and more alive than ever. In fact, this was such a spectacle that people began making small pilgrimages to visit his head, such that the government finally just had to take it down. I sure hope that story is true, because they deserved to be rebuked by John Fisher even in his death. Now, 400 years exactly after the deaths of these two great men, in 1935, they were canonized. And so we call them St. Thomas More and St. John Fisher. But I taught Western civilization at the college level in New York for 7 years. And I always looked for a good textbook. And the textbook always told us about the heroism of St. Thomas More. And of course, there's the wonderful movie, Man for All Seasons. But I never found a single textbook that told us about the sacrifice of John Fisher, this glorious bishop who had been treated so badly by the regime, who had been maneuvered and manipulated into saying things that could be declared criminal and treasonous. His is an extraordinary witness, and we ought to have recourse to him very often. But even after the death of King Henry VIII in 1547, that wasn't the end of the troubles people had in England trying to follow the Pope. A couple years later, around 5,000 Catholics in England perished when the new king, Edward VI, took away their beloved Latin Mass. That was the great Western Rising that nobody's ever heard about. But coming closer to the present, I want to call to our minds the French Revolution. Because episodes in the French Revolution regarding the church are so vivid and so astonishing, you almost can't believe these things happened. In fact, most people don't even know about these events. But they are so astonishing and so almost subhumanly cruel that we can say almost with confidence that surely there was a diabolical aspect to them. The French Revolution began in 1789, and within a year, and indeed 2 years, the church found that her property was nationalized, which is a nice way of saying ripped away from her by the government. Priests were required to take oaths of loyalty to the new government. Not all did so, understandably. Monasteries were suppressed. And, by the way, they were suppressed on the grounds of religious freedom. So in the name of religious freedom, you cannot be free to be a monk. So you go figure that out. Well, this type of thing went on early on. This is the so-called moderate phase of the revolution. But as time went on, the revolution grew more and more explicitly anti-Catholic. In fact, by 1793, things had grown almost hysterically worse. 1793 to 1794, it's there that we see what became known as the Reign of Terror. And here, if you were a Catholic and were outspoken about it in some way, you could be in trouble just for that. You could be called a fanatic because you were found praying the rosary, or because you had sheltered a priest who had refused to take that oath of loyalty. There were terrible crimes carried out against ordinary Catholics, young men, sick and healthy, women and men together, children, all subject to the same terrible crimes. For example, the drownings at Nantes. Thousands of Catholics perished in the drownings at Nantes, which consisted of taking people in boats out into the River Loire, and then the tormentors in the boats would jump to other boats, and before doing so, they would open up holes in the initial boat so that the boat would sink and the people on it would drown. The man who carried this out, Jean-Baptiste Carrier, said, "Never have I had so much amusement as in seeing the last grimaces of priests as they die." Beyond the drownings at Nantes, we have the shootings at Angers. We have the martyrs who are called the Martyrs of Avrillé, 100 of whom were beatified by Pope John Paul II, and many favors have been won through their intercession. But there, the Martyrs of Avrillé were marched to some ditches that had been dug, and it was decided that the way to deal with these unruly Catholics was to line them up against the ditches and to shoot them all so that they would fall into the ditches and perish. Many female